Hello everyone. Today we are going to be teaching you all about the development of apartheid in South Africa. This presentation was put together by Jack, Khalid, and Hayden. First section, we will be discussing the Department of Native Affairs. But first, we need to cover some basics about apartheid connected to the Department of Native Affairs. First, the election of the National Party influenced race relations within the country. At this point in time, race was coming more to the forefront of each issue, and it dictated many of the government's decisions. Organizations, particularly the Department of Native Affairs, centralized government power regarding race and made decisions that were in the government's interest on the basis of race. So, what was the significance of the Department of Native Affairs? Well, it effectively dictated the conditions of natives in South Africa, and it had the power to make decisions regarding their status. Although the department grew to oppress natives, it wasn't always set on that. In fact, not only was the Department of Native Affairs not yet committed to the strengthening of apartheid, but the Minister for Native Affairs as late as 1949 actually supported black rights and improvements in South Africa. However, though Jansen was more supportive of native rights in South Africa, the department started to shift with the transition of power to Hendrik Verwoerd. Hendrik Verwoerd was the Minister of the Department of Native Affairs following Jansen, and he was completely dedicated to apartheid and expanding the power of the Department of Native Affairs. He came to South Africa at a young age, and many of his ideas surrounding what he called protecting Africans from Western influence by separating them were influenced by Werner Island, who he worked with. So how was this system of apartheid allowed? Well, some historians such as Ivan Evans argued that the department was so powerful that it was hard to challenge, and it simply became accepted by Africans as a result. It was also easy to implement because the department had the support of tribal chieftains and even convinced urban tenants that they would benefit from being put in new locations. Now let's move on to some of the economic expansions of the Department of Native Affairs. Over the years, the Department of Native Affairs rapidly grew in money and influence. The budget increased from £570,000 to over £7 million from 1936 to 1960, demonstrating the heavy investment into the department. Paired with this rise in budget was a rise in staff that directly correlated with the increased spending. Now let's examine how apartheid was established and continued. It was continued through things like the Labor Bureau, segregated townships, forced removals, the development of Bantustans, and think tanks like the South African Bureau of Racial Affairs.
This is Chapter 5, Advancements to Apartheid, Section 2. After the National Party took control in 1948, one of their top priorities was to turn segregation into law, which was stuff that was previously informal or inconsistent discrimination now became an entire legal system. These laws weren't random. They worked together to control every aspect of life for non-South Africans. The main goal was to divide the population based on race. To begin, the Population Regression Act was the backbone to apartheid. It legally defined a person's race and forced everyone to carry an identification card showing their classification. The way race was determined was incredibly flawed. It includes stuff like your physical features, the type of drinks you would drink, the sports you played, how you dressed, and so forth. This law would tear families apart, especially children who were classified differently with their parents. It also enforces all other apartheid laws, like who you can marry, where you can live, and like what hospital or school you can go to. The Group Acts of 1950, it divided land and certain areas for certain races. A lot of people would be kicked out of their homes or sent back to homeland or townships outside the outskirts because they weren't white or if they didn't match a certain race. An example of this is Sophia Town. Sophia Town was a mixed, mostly black neighborhood full of culture, art, energy. It was one of the few places where different races lived together. The government hated this, so in like 1955 they sent an armed police before dawn, and they went and started killing people. Families were broken apart, belongings were left behind, and they were taken to the Meadowlands, basically a lifeless township. The government then renamed Sophia Town to Terifum. This is a dark reminder of their victory over the land. Following that, there was the Bantu Authorities Act. This basically said that Black South Africans weren't actual citizens of South Africa. Rather, they belonged to the Bantus. These homelands were supposed to be independent, and they weren't. They were very underfunded, overcrowded. You couldn't support their people. They you couldn't feed your people. The government ignored all the fundings. The Native Law Amendment in 1952, this law tightened the pass system, making it harder for Black people to live or work in cities, and also introduces reference books, which Black men and women had to carry. This stuff included like photos, work history, material status, and if you didn't have it on you, you would be arrested or fined. Following that, there was a separate representative of voters act. This basically removed colored people's right to vote in the Cape Province. It's one of the only regions where they were actually allowed to vote. There was a lot of backlash. Even the courts ruled it invalid, but the National Party just went on with it, and they didn't really care too much. This would lead to movements like the Torch Commando, the Black Slash, and the Franchise Action Council. After that, there was
In the third section, we will be looking into different opinions regarding the National Party, apartheid, and the overall development of the system present in South Africa. Essentially, Ivan Evans argued that apartheid was not necessarily premeditated or thoroughly planned, but it was rather composed of several developments that simply grew together into what we know as apartheid. In addition, Alistair Sparks added that the National Party did not develop apartheid out of thin air, but rather built off of existing law. On the other hand, historians like Anthony Butler question whether the same outcome would have happened if the United Party did not win, emphasizing that the party was integral in establishing the development of apartheid over time. This means that the influence of the National Party was largely limited to its makeup and its political influence, as its ability to strengthen apartheid increased with increased victories. Some historians like G.H.L. LeMay and William Beinhart found the middle ground and saw that the National Party followed precedent but also put race more at the forefront. This was also supported by Saul Dubois, who claimed that the surprising nature of the National Party's victory proves that they couldn't have planned apartheid in advance. All these arguments come together to show that the election of the National Party immediately threatened race relations and concerned people within South Africa.
The main ideas of Section 4 are an increase of direct action, some being more successful than others, more cooperation among opposition groups despite conflicts between them, and greater opposition from the government. The Women's Pass protest of 1956 was in response to a new amendment requiring women to carry passbooks. 20,000 participated in the march after getting 100,000 signatures. After continued protests, many were killed or arrested. The protest was unable to omit women from carrying passbooks, but the protest radicalized the Black Slash organization, which helped African women by bailing them out of jail and providing them with cheap lawyers. White groups that opposed apartheid also existed. The non-racial Communist Party, Progressive Party, and the Liberal Party all fought against apartheid laws. The Alexandria bus boycott was in response to bus fares being raised to 3 pence. After thousands started walking to work and their protest spread, the fares were lowered back to 2 pence. The potato boycott was in response to poor working conditions and exploitation of African farm workers. The boycott was successful and conditions improved for the workers. The Shebeen protests were a result of Cato Manor being turned into a white designated area. Protests broke out in which Shebeen owners attacked government-run facilities. In the end, authorities forcefully removed the Africans from Cato Manor. An example of conflict among ethnic groups is the Durban riots. Africans destroyed Indian shops that they believed were overcharging them on food. Authorities did not take action as whites weren't affected. Overall, there was still increased cooperation and shared goals among those fighting apartheid. The day of protest was a response to the Suppression of Communism Act. The SAIC, ANC, APO, and SACP all called for it. Many Africans participated by staying home from work or protesting. The Suppression of Communism Act also scared Nelson Mandela enough to create the M Plan, and his leaders needed to talk without restrictions. The ANCYL was also created to focus on more direct action. The ANC sent a letter to the Prime Minister to end apartheid and the Suppression of Communism Act, but he refused. In response, the Defiance Campaign was implemented, which focused on overwhelming prisons and then widespread strikes and protests. Albert Luthuli had a big part in the campaign. Because of his role as president of the ANC, he was dismissed from being a chief of a tribe. His document, The Road to Freedom is the Cross, advocated nonviolence. The positive outcomes of the campaign were the growth of the ANC, successful nonviolence, and the realization that white nonviolence was helpful. While nonviolence was helpful, it cannot end apartheid on its own. The negative outcomes were that the government limited support through propaganda and spied on activists. The ones who organized the campaigns were arrested, and phase 2 barely went into effect. Retaliatory laws were also put into place. The government gave itself the ability to suspend all laws and enacted a guilty until proven innocent policy. The Public Safety Act gave the government the ability to indefinitely declare a state of emergency. The Criminal Law Amendment Act assumed those who accompanied criminals were also guilty. In response to the demands of the people, a Freedom Charter was presented to a People's Congress. The charter was ratified, but the police arrested many of the people present at the ratification. The charter demanded equal political rights for everyone, the end of apartheid and discrimination, legal equality, human rights, freedoms to join trade unions, fair employment practices, equal educational opportunity, decent housing conditions, and peaceful foreign relations. In response to the assembly of the Congress that the Freedom Charter was presented to, the Righteous Assemblies Act was announced. This allowed any open-air meeting to be banned. 18 months after the ratification of the Freedom Charter, many members who ratified it were arrested. Most of them were quickly let go, but it took years for the last 30 to be acquitted. By the time they were, the government had become even more oppressive and ambitious. Another important event is the split of the Pan-Africanist Congress from the ANC, partly because of disagreements about the Freedom Charter. These are the most important things to remember from this section.
Section 5 will discuss instances of rural unrest in South Africa. In many cases, rural communities found themselves in positions where they needed to fight back against oppressive forms of government. Rural unrest was unique from other forms of unrest because they were more difficult to suppress due to their unpredictable nature. The Zeerust Uprising in 1957 was caused by the imposition of passes for women living in Zeerust. The local chief refused to force women to comply, which caused him to be dismissed from his position. As a result, women started to boycott white-owned areas where passes were handed out, which pushed the rebellion forwards. Following the dismissal of the chief, men and women that were originally from the area gathered, even from distant areas, to protest and fight back. 100 men who returned were arrested, and some were even accused of murder. And women resisted by burning their passes and boycotting schools where teachers accepted the passes. But what was the outcome of the Zeerust Uprising? Well, most of this rebellion was centered around the level of power held by chieftains, but this particular rebellion was stopped, and the women were forced to accept the conditions that were imposed upon them. The next example we will look at is East Ponderland. In this instance, Chief Botha Sikau sided with the authorities in disputes about land, and he also had corrupt councillors who were accused of selling parts of the land away to companies. These councillors were frequently attacked, causing the government to need to send in protective forces to support them. There were also frequent clashes between residents and the police, most notably at Nkandile. The residents demanded that Sikau and his supporters should be replaced, but being ignored, they chose to boycott white-owned stores instead. Ultimately, these protests were unsuccessful, with the boycott ending in 1961. They were generally ineffective in creating change of the conditions. Last but not least, we have the 1959 Promotion of Self-Government Act. This act made local chieftains into extensions of the government rather than representing the ideas of the residents themselves. This made it easier for the government to control these areas, expanded white influence, and further tipped the power imbalance in South Africa.